Unit 3, the offer, another way besides God's. Well, we left off at the end of Unit 2, looking at the end of this verse right here, which is the last verse of Genesis 2, which says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. They shall become one flesh." And it says, "And they were both naked, and the man and his wife were not ashamed." So Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 both end on a very positive note, right? God looked over all creation and said it was very good at the end of Genesis 1, our summary chapter. And at the end of Genesis 2, he is pleased with his creation at the sixth day. He's pleased with man. Man is the way that God has designed them to be. Man and woman are meant to accompany each other. They are designed that way. And man, I wish our Bibles ended at Genesis 2:25, but we know that they don't. So what happens next? Well, this is where now we go into Genesis 3, and this is the first verse of Genesis 3. It says, "Now the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God has made." Now, we know from studying the Bible that this is actually Satan, right? And we learn something specific about his character that we may not have focused on before, and that is his cunning nature. He is smart. He is intelligent. He's been around a long time, right? And he is not for us. He's against Adam and Eve, and we haven't gotten to that part yet, but they don't know that. And so what we see here is a very, very important scene that is going to inform everything that we study from here forward. This conversation is pivotal. So let's look at how it goes, right? So he starts off saying that he was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, and he asks her this question, "Has God indeed said, 'You shall not eat of every tree of the garden'?" So just leaving this question up here, the conversation starts with the question. It says, "Has God indeed said, 'You shall not eat of every tree of the garden'?" So what is going on here, right? Is this kind of a fact-fighting question? Is this him saying, I wasn't sure on the details, like where are the boundaries, what are the rules? Is that what's really going on here? Is he trying to find facts, or is it something else? Well, if we look at the sequence where we left off last time, we just kind of reviewing quickly, we know that God existed as Trinity, eternally, right? Was not created. He creates the heavens where the angels dwell. He creates the angels. He creates the earth and the physical world. Lucifer, as well as the other angels, witness the creation, and Lucifer's heart swells with pride and envy. He wants the praise that God receives when the angels witness him creating the physical realm. And we know that he turns the other angels against God, and they become demons. There is some sort of rebellion in heaven where where the demons and Satan are cast out, and they're cast to the earth, and where God is still using them, is going to use them for his ultimate purposes, but they are banished from their original design, as we looked at in Module 2. And then Satan gets people to turn from God, just like he did with the angels. But that's actually not the next thing that happens, right? Something has to happen before Satan can get people, the pinnacle of God's creation that we looked at previously, to turn from God. And what needs to happen first? Well, what needs to happen is that he needs to get people to distrust God or disobey God, right? And he does this by convincing them that God is not out for their highest good. So if we update our order right here, let's go back into Genesis 3, and let's look at what happens, right? So verse 1 says that the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field, which the Lord God had made. And he says to the woman, "Has God indeed said, 'You shall not eat of every tree'?" So we kind of asked earlier, like, what's really being asked here? Okay, if his intentions are actually not just fact-fighting, but they're actually malicious, the text says, "Has God indeed said?" But it could say, "Did God really mean? Did God really mean you shall not eat of the tree of the garden?" And I think kind of even a more honest and penetrating wording, right? Not to rephrase the translation, but I think what's really being asked here is this: do you really plan on obeying the command that you shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And this is, I think, the spirit of the question, right? And what we know from looking at the timeline, looking at Lucifer and his hatred for people and his hatred for God, is that this is a direct affront to God's rulership. This is an attack. Now, they don't know it's an attack, but it's an attack nonetheless. Now, Eve, of course, being the second person that's ever existed, doesn't know what's going on, doesn't see between the lines. And so she answers the question on a fact basis. And she says, when the woman said to the serpent, Her name isn't even Eve yet. We'll get to that in a second. But the woman responds, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die." Now, she gets that wrong because God did not say that you shall not touch it. He clearly said, you shall not eat it, lest you die. Now, what does the serpent say in response? This is very important. Verse 4 says, "Then the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die." Then he goes on, "For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So this is the response. He asks her a question, she gives him a response, and then he responds back. Now, this is very important because here we see one of Satan's most common tactics, and that is lies that sound true because they contain some truth, but they're still lies at the core. So let's examine real quick what he actually said to her. Okay, what are the lies that the serpent uses on Eve or on the woman? First thing he says is, "You will not surely die," in verse 4. And then in verse 5, he says that God knows that your eyes will be opened, and he says that you will be like God. Now, there's truth in each one of these, right? When they disobey, do they actually drop dead? No, they don't. But something about them does die. We learn that from the text. We also learn that their eyes are opened, but it's not a good thing, right? And he says, you will be like God. Well, guess what? In a sense, they already are like God. They are made in the image of God. But each one of these is at its core a lie, because what is meant by these three phrases? Well, when he says you will not surely die, what is really being communicated from the serpent is that God is lying to you. This is a direct refusal of something that God very clearly said. He's saying, nope, God is lying to you. On the second one, where he says God knows your eyes will be opened, the meaning there, I think, is that God is keeping things from you. He's holding back. He doesn't want you to be a part. He's deceiving you in some way. And the last one, who says you will be like God, I think insinuates that you won't need God anymore. So though there is truth in each of these phrases, ultimately they are lies. But what are these lies ultimately about? Well, this is so important to know going forward. The serpent's offer to the woman is all about one thing: autonomy from God. And even more specifically than that, it is all about autonomy from God's rulership. The offer is very simply, you don't have to follow God. You don't have to believe in God. He does not have to rule over you. And that is what he is selling, right? Now, he's very cunning and he's very smart, and they don't understand. And so how do they respond to this offer? Well, that's what we're going to look at in Unit 4, the response. We're going to look exactly how Adam and Eve respond to the offer from the serpent.